My wife spent $22,000 of our savings on a man she had never met in person, a man who did not exist, a man whose photographs had been stolen from a fitness model in Sao Paulo and whose voice she'd never once heard, and she did it in pieces over 5 months, transferring money to accounts with names like Alvarez Marine Logistics and Coastal Freight Solutions LLC, believing every single time that she was rescuing the love of her life from a customs disaster in international waters. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that by the time she tried to make the final transfer, the one that would have emptied what was left of our joint retirement account, there was nothing left in that account for her to send, because I had quietly moved every dollar we owned into a new account 11 days earlier, one she did not have access to and did not know existed, and I had done it without telling her a single word about why. My name is Marcus Reilly. I am 43 years old, and for the last 12 years I have worked as an operations manager for a regional freight and warehousing company outside a small city called Ashford Falls, Pennsylvania, the kind of place where the biggest employer is a distribution center, and the second biggest employer is the hospital that treats everyone who gets hurt working at the distribution center. I want to tell you what my wife did, and what I did in response, and I want to tell it slowly, in order, because if I just give you the ending, the part where I show up at my own kitchen table with a folder of bank statements and watch her face change forever, you will not understand why I waited as long as I did, or why I did not simply scream at her the moment I found out, or why, when it was finally over, I felt less like a man who had won something and more like a man standing in the wreckage of a house he used to love, holding the only undamaged photograph he could find. I need to tell you first who Denise was before any of this happened, because the woman at the centre of this story is not a villain in the way you might already be picturing her, and if I let you believe that from the first minute I will have lied to you by omission, which is exactly the kind of lie this whole story is about. Denise and I met 16 years ago at a continuing education class at the community college in Ashford Falls, of all places, a Tuesday night bookkeeping course she was taking to move up from receptionist to office manager at the dental practice where she worked, and I was taking because my company was paying for it and I had nothing better to do on Tuesday nights back then. She sat 2 seats over, and on the second week she leaned across and asked to borrow my calculator because hers had died. And I remember thinking, with the specific clarity you sometimes get about a person, before you have any real reason to have an opinion about them yet, that I wanted to know what her house looked like on a Sunday morning. We got married 2 years later at a small Methodist church her grandmother had attended her whole life. 40 guests, my brother as best man, her father crying through the entire ceremony in a way that embarrasses him to this day when I bring it up. We built an ordinary decent life together over the 14 years that followed. I worked my way up from a warehouse floor supervisor to operations manager, which is a title that sounds more impressive than the salary attached to it, but it paid our mortgage, and it paid for braces, and it paid for a Honda Odyssey with 208,000 miles on it that I am, against all reasonable advice, still nursing along because a new one is not in the budget this year. Denise became the office manager she'd been studying to become, and then some years later took a better position managing billing and scheduling for a small orthopedic practice across town, work she was good at and quietly proud of. The kind of pride that shows up in how carefully someone organises a filing cabinet nobody else will ever see. We have 2 children, Tyler, who is 14, and has spent the last 2 years transforming from a kid who wanted to talk to us about everything into a teenager who communicates primarily in single-word answers and closed bedroom doors, which I am told is developmentally normal and does not stop it from being its own quiet grief. And Sophie, who is 9, who still runs to the door when I get home from work, who has decided this year that she wants to be a marine biologist specifically because of a book about octopuses she read in 3rd grade, and who asks me with real seriousness whether octopuses get lonely, a question I still do not have a good answer for. I'm telling you all of this, the calculator and the church and the filing cabinet and the octopus question, because I need you to understand that we were not a family in obvious trouble. We were not a couple who fought constantly, or who had stopped speaking to each other, or who slept in separate rooms out of some slow-building resentment that had been building for years. We were tired, the way every family with a mortgage and 2 kids and 2 full-time jobs is tired, and there had been a specific kind of loneliness that had crept into our marriage over the 18 months before any of this started. A loneliness I want to describe honestly because I think it matters enormously to what happened. But we were not broken in any way that would have predicted what came next. I want to be very clear about that from the beginning, because I have read enough about this particular kind of scam since it happened to us to know that people always want a tidy explanation. She must have been unhappy, he must have been neglecting her, there must have been a reason that makes it make sense. Sometimes there is a reason. Ours had one, and I'm not going to hide from it. But the reason was smaller and sadder and more ordinary than anyone wants to believe. And it is exactly the kind of reason that could apply to nearly any long marriage on any ordinary street in any ordinary town, which is precisely what makes this story worth telling. The loneliness started, if I trace it back honestly, with my mother's decline. My mother Eileen had a stroke 2 years ago that left her needing help with things she had done herself for 78 years, and because my brother lives in Arizona and calls twice a year, the actual weight of it fell on me, which meant weekends at her house doing the things she could no longer do, evenings on the phone with home health aides and insurance companies, a specific, grinding exhaustion that ate into exactly the hours Denise and I used to spend together after the kids went to bed. I did not handle it well, in the sense that I did not talk to Denise about how much it was costing me, emotionally, to watch my mother lose pieces of herself one at a time. I came home from those weekends quiet, and I told myself I was protecting Denise from a burden she did not need to carry too. And what I actually did, without meaning to, was build a wall between us made of exactly the kind of silence that looks like strength from the outside and feels like abandonment from the inside. Denise told me later, in one of the conversations we had after everything came out, that she had started to feel, over that 1.5 years, like she was living with a man who came home to the same house every night, but had stopped actually arriving in it. Those were her words. He stopped arriving. I have not been able to forget them, and I do not think I want to forget them, because they were true, and because a story that pretends the truth was not true does not help anybody. Into that specific gap, that particular loneliness of a woman whose husband was present in body and absent in whatever the word is for the rest of a person, walked a man named Adrian Cole, or at least that was the name attached to the photographs and the profile that reached out to her on a hobby forum for amateur watercolour painters, a hobby Denise had picked back up that same difficult year, almost like a form of self-medication, something quiet and solitary she could do at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed on the nights I was at my mother's. Adrian Cole's profile picture showed a lean, weathered, good-looking man in his late 40s standing on the deck of what the caption described as his own cargo ship, and the profile said he was a marine logistics consultant, American, originally from Ohio, currently working contracts that took him through ports in West Africa and Southeast Asia, which explained, conveniently, exactly why a video call was always somehow impossible and a phone call always had somehow terrible connection quality that dissolved into static after 90 seconds. I know now, because I have since done the research any reasonably determined person can do in an evening, that those photographs belong to an actual real person, a fitness model and part-time ships officer from Sao Paulo, Brazil, a man who has almost certainly never heard of Denise Reilly or Ashford Falls, Pennsylvania, and who has had his identity stolen and worn like a mask by God knows how many men running this same exact script on God knows how many lonely women across God knows how many small towns in this country. He messaged her first about her paintings, which is, I have since learned, exactly how this particular kind of scam almost always begins. Not with a wolf whistle or an obvious pickup line, but with genuine-sounding praise for something a person has actually made and is quietly proud of, and does not get complimented on very often. He told her a watercolour she had posted, a study of the harbour in a nearby town where we used to take the kids crabbing, showed real emotional intelligence in the brushwork, an oddly specific and flattering phrase for a stranger to use about a hobbyist's Tuesday night painting, and Denise, who had not heard anything resembling that particular kind of attention from me in longer than either of us wants to admit, answered him. That is where it began, not with a lie about money. With a compliment about a painting 4 months before he ever once mentioned needing anything from her at all. I did not know any of this was happening. I want to say that plainly because there is a version of this story where the husband is willfully blind, where he suspects something and looks away because it is easier, and that is not what happened here, or at least it is not what I believe happened, though I have turned that question over in my head more times than I can count since. Denise was careful, in the specific way people become careful when they have started keeping something from a spouse they still love and do not yet think of as a betrayal, more as a private garden they are tending that does not need to involve anyone else yet. She messaged him from her phone, mostly during the day at work or late at night after I was asleep, and I noticed, if I am honest, that she seemed a little brighter for a while, a little more present with the kids, a little less like a woman quietly drowning in the specific exhaustion of a marriage running on fumes, and I remember actually being relieved about it, thinking whatever she's doing with those paintings is good for her, without ever once wondering what exactly was making her light up like that on a Tuesday night at the kitchen table. The turn from friendship to something else happened, according to everything I have pieced together since, in the 5th month, right around the time Adrian Cole told her, over a series of increasingly personal messages, that his own marriage had ended 2 years earlier when his wife had died of ovarian cancer, a detail engineered with the specific cruelty of matching, almost exactly the kind of loss a woman like Denise, watching her mother-in-law slowly disappear and her own husband disappear right alongside her, would find devastating and recognizable and safe to fall toward. He told her he had not felt understood by anyone since his wife died, that the loneliness of being at sea for months at a time made ordinary human connection feel like a language he had forgotten how to speak, and that talking to her, a woman on the other side of the world he had never met, had been the first time in 2 years he had felt like himself again. I do not know exactly what Denise wrote back to that message. I have seen it since, because I eventually saw all of it, and I am choosing not to repeat her exact words here, because I think even now, even after everything, she's entitled to that much privacy about the specific private way she was reaching for something. But I know the tone of it, because I know my wife, and the tone of it was relief. The tone of it was a woman who had been lonely inside her own marriage for a year and a half finally being asked how she was doing, and truly meaning it when she answered. The money did not start for another 6 weeks after that, and it did not start large. It started with $40 for what Adrian described as an international data plan he needed to keep messaging her from a remote port with unreliable internet access. A request so small and so specific and so plausible that Denise later told me she barely thought twice about it. Sent it through a gift card code because that was somehow the only method that worked from wherever he supposedly was, and thought nothing more of it, the way you think nothing of loaning a friend gas money. 6 weeks after that came a genuinely engineered crisis, a story about a shipping container of specialized industrial parts held up at a port in Lagos over a customs dispute, a bribery demand dressed up in official-sounding language about port authority fees and demurrage charges, a story constructed with just enough real logistics vocabulary, container numbers, bill of lading references, terms Denise had actually heard me use at the dinner table over the years without ever fully understanding, to sound completely legitimate to a woman who had no reason yet to disbelieve the man she'd been talking to every single day for 5 months. That first real request was $800. She sent it from a savings account she had opened years earlier under her own name, a small account from before we were married that she had kept separate out of nothing more sinister than habit, money from an inheritance from her grandmother that had sat mostly untouched for a decade, and Adrian Cole thanked her with what she later described to a therapist as the most grateful, tender words anyone had ever said to her, and told her the container would clear within days, and that he would pay her back the moment it did, with interest, because that was the kind of man he was. The container never cleared, of course, because there was no container, and no port, and no Adrian Cole standing on any deck anywhere in the world. There was instead an operation, one I have since learned quite a lot about, that runs a script refined over thousands of identical conversations with thousands of identical Denises, a script where the crisis always resolves itself only after one more payment and then one more after that, each one framed as the very last obstacle before the money he supposedly had, some improbable inheritance or business fortune supposedly waiting on the other side of every single crisis, could finally be freed and shared and used to build the actual life together that he described to her in increasing and increasingly specific detail over the following months. He told her about a house he wanted to buy once he retired from shipping in Charleston near the water, with a porch he described in enough sensory detail, the specific colour he wanted to paint the shutters, the exact kind of ceiling fan that Denise began, without ever fully admitting it to herself, picturing her own life on that porch. I want to walk through the mechanics of how this actually unfolded over those 5 months, because I think the detail matters, and because I think anyone listening who believes they could never fall for something like this needs to understand exactly how gradual and exactly how reasonable each individual step felt to a woman who is, in every other measurable way, an intelligent, capable, skeptical adult. After the $800 for the container, there was a 2-week silence. Engineered, I now understand, specifically to let the previous payment settle in her mind as a reasonable, almost forgettable transaction rather than the first domino in a chain. And then Adrian returned with gratitude and warmth, and no mention of money at all for nearly 3 weeks, rebuilding trust, re-establishing the emotional current between them before the next crisis arrived. This one supposedly a medical emergency involving a crew member he felt responsible for. A young sailor from the Philippines, he said, who needed emergency treatment in a country where the hospital demanded cash up front before treating a foreign national. That one was $1,200, and Denise later told the fraud investigator we eventually spoke with that she remembered feeling, sending that payment, not fear or suspicion, but a kind of pride. The specific pride of being the kind of woman who helps when someone asks. The same instinct, I think, that had made her a good office manager and a good mother and a good friend for her entire adult life. An instinct that a stranger on the other side of a stolen photograph had learned to point like a weapon. By the 3rd month of actual payments, the amounts had climbed considerably, and the stories had grown more elaborate. A bribe to a port official in Ghana, a legal fee to release a vessel impounded over a paperwork dispute that was never quite explained clearly enough for anyone thinking clearly to accept it, a fee to expedite an inheritance from a deceased business partner that was, Adrian assured her, worth considerably more than every payment combined and would arrive any week now. A phrase that appears, I've since learned, in nearly identical form in thousands of documented romance scam transcripts, collected by fraud investigators across this country, any week now, the 4 words that keep a victim paying for months after any objective observer would have walked away. Denise emptied her grandmother's inheritance account first, roughly $9,000 over the course of 6 weeks, and when that ran dry, she did something that still, even now, makes my chest tighten when I think about it too long. She opened a personal line of credit in her own name, using her own credit history without telling me, and began drawing against that, first for smaller amounts, then for a $14,000 payment tied to what Adrian described as a critical, one-time opportunity to invest in a cargo shipment that would, once sold, pay back every dollar she had ever sent him 3 times over, a number so specific and so mathematically persuasive, 16% above market rate, escrow protected, insured through a maritime underwriter whose name she could look up online and did look up online, finding a real company whose real name had simply been borrowed for the lie that she told the investigator later she felt, for the first time in the entire relationship, not like she was helping a man she loved, but like she was making a smart financial decision that happened to also help a man she loved, which she said made it feel, somehow, even safer than the earlier payments had. I want to pause here and describe what was actually happening in our house during these same months, because I was living an entirely different version of this same period of time, one where I noticed things but did not understand what I was noticing. I noticed Denise was spending more time on her phone, but we live in the world we live in, and everyone's spouse spends more time on their phone than they used to. And I did not think much of it beyond the ordinary low-grade irritation of watching someone scroll during a movie we were supposedly watching together. I noticed she seemed distracted some evenings, staring at nothing over the kitchen sink, and I asked her once, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Fine, just tired. Work's been a lot." And I believed her, because work actually had been a lot. The orthopedic practice she managed had just implemented a new billing system that was, by her own accurate account, a genuine nightmare for 3 straight months, which gave every distracted evening a completely reasonable explanation that had nothing to do with what was actually happening. I noticed, if I am being fully honest, that she seemed happier in some specific way I could not name, more like the woman I had married and less like the exhausted co-parent I had been living alongside for the previous 1.5 years, and God help me, I was grateful for it. I remember specifically feeling grateful, thinking whatever she's doing to feel better, I hope she keeps doing it, without ever once asking what that whatever actually was. The first concrete thing I noticed, the first thing that registered as a fact rather than a feeling, came in the 4th month, when I logged into our joint checking account to pay the electric bill, and saw a balance considerably lower than I expected, low enough that I actually opened the transaction history, which I will admit I did not do often, because Denise had always handled the day-to-day bill paying and I handled the mortgage and the retirement contributions, a division of labour that had made sense for 14 years and that I am now aware also made me, for those same 14 years, functionally blind to exactly the kind of movement of money that was happening right in front of me. I saw 2 transfers to a linked external account I did not recognize, $400 and $600, both within the same week, and I remember the specific, small, unremarkable question that went through my head, which was not suspicion, not yet, just ordinary household bookkeeping curiosity. I asked her about it that night after the kids were in bed. Casually, the way you ask about any line item on a bill, "Hey, what's this transfer to an account ending in 4471? And I want to describe her face in that exact moment, because I have replayed it in my mind more times than any other single expression she has ever made at me in 16 years of marriage. There was a half second, less than a half second, where something moved behind her eyes that I did not have a name for yet, and then it was gone, replaced by an answer delivered so smoothly, so immediately, that if I had not happened to catch that half second first, I would never have thought twice about it. She said, "Oh, that's for a group gift for Carol's retirement party at work. We're all chipping in. I'll show you the card everyone's signing." And she did, in fact, produce a card 2 days later, signed by 6 or 7 names I recognised from her office, and I felt in that moment mildly foolish for having asked at all, the specific foolishness of a husband who briefly suspected his wife of something and turned out to be wrong, which is a feeling designed, I now understand, to make you considerably less likely to ask the next question, and the one after that, for a good long while. I have thought about that card more than almost anything else in this entire story, because it tells you something important about what actually happened over the following months, which is that this was not a woman clumsily hiding sloppy transactions from an inattentive husband. This was a woman who had, without ever consciously deciding to become someone capable of this, built an entire secondary infrastructure of explanation, ready in advance, deployed instantly and convincingly the one time I happened to ask a direct question. I do not believe, even now, that Denise sat down one afternoon and planned an elaborate system of lies the way you'd plan a heist. I believe, and I have come to believe this slowly and with real effort, that each individual lie was small and specific, and born in the actual moment she needed it, a defense thrown up instinctively to protect something she'd convinced herself was not actually dangerous, a friendship, a kindness, a private garden that did not need my permission to exist, and that the accumulation of a dozen small instinctive lies over 5 months adds up to something that looks, from the outside, exactly like a sophisticated deception, even when it did not start that way and was not planned that way from the beginning. The moment everything actually cracked open for me came in the 5th month, on an ordinary Wednesday evening in late autumn, and it came from a source so mundane that I still find it faintly absurd, considering the size of what it uncovered. My mother, whose stroke recovery had by then plateaued into a stable but demanding routine of twice-weekly visits, needed help setting up a new tablet her home health aide had suggested for video calls with her grandchildren, and I had borrowed Denise's old spare phone, the one she kept in a kitchen drawer as a backup device since she'd upgraded the year before, to use as a temporary hotspot while I configured my mother's new device at her house, because our home internet account was, for reasons I will spare you, temporarily suspended over a billing dispute with our provider that same week, a genuinely unrelated coincidence that I have thought about with something like dark amusement more than once since. While the spare phone was hotspotting, a notification banner slid across the top of the screen, a message preview from an app called Secure Chat, a name I did not recognize showing 3 words before it disappeared, "Missing you already," and beneath it, a name I also did not recognize, Adrian. I want to be honest about what I felt in that exact moment, because it was not yet suspicion of infidelity, not fully, not at first. It was confusion, the specific confusion of seeing a puzzle piece that does not seem to belong to any puzzle you know about. I assumed genuinely, for about 10 minutes, that it might be spam, or a wrong number, or some leftover notification from an old contact of hers I'd simply never met. One of the dozens of people who pass through a marriage as acquaintances without ever becoming part of your actual shared life. I did not go looking through the phone that night. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters to how the rest of this unfolded. I finished setting up my mother's tablet, drove home and said nothing, turning the 3 words over in my head the entire drive, "Missing you already," in a voice that was, I told myself, almost certainly innocent, almost certainly explainable, and I did not sleep well that night lying next to a woman I still at that point trusted completely, which is its own particular kind of loneliness, suspecting something you do not yet have the courage or the evidence to name. I did not confront her that week. I want to explain why, because I think the reasoning matters, and because I have had to defend this decision to more than one person since, including, memorably, my own brother, who told me flatly that he would have had it out on the kitchen table within the hour. I'm not built that way, and more importantly, I had spent enough years managing operations at a company where a wrong accusation, made too fast and too loud, could cost you the trust of an entire warehouse floor for months, to know that the first thing you do when you suspect something is broken is not confront, it is gather, quietly and completely, before you say a single word, because the moment you show your hand, whatever you have not yet found becomes considerably harder to find, and whatever explanation the other person constructs in response to your accusation will be built specifically to survive exactly the evidence you've already shown them. I decided that week quietly, without telling Denise, without telling anyone, that I was going to find out exactly what missing you already meant before I said one word about it to my wife. I started small and carefully, the way you learn to start things carefully after 12 years of operations work, where the difference between a functioning warehouse and a chaotic one is almost always a matter of noticing details before they become disasters. I did not go through her phone directly, not that first week, because I did not have her passcode, and because I did not want my first move to be one she might notice and delete evidence in response to. Instead, I did what I actually know how to do, which is look at money, because money leaves a trail that a phone conversation does not, and because I had already seen one transfer to an account I did not recognize, explained away with a retirement card that I now went back and actually examined instead of simply accepting, and noticed on closer inspection that 3 of the 7 signatures on that card were in suspiciously similar handwriting to each other, a detail I'm not proud of noticing this late, but which cracked something open once I finally looked at it properly instead of gratefully accepting it at face value. I spent the better part of 3 weeks doing something I never imagined myself doing, which was quietly auditing my own marriage the way I would audit a supplier account showing irregular shipment numbers. I requested full statement histories, going back 8 months from every account Denise had access to, our joint checking, our joint savings, and critically, a personal line of credit report I pulled using a service our mortgage broker had once recommended for monitoring identity theft, a report that showed, to my genuine shock, an open line of credit in Denise's name that I had never seen a single statement for, opened 5 months earlier, currently carrying a balance of just over $17,000, a balance that had been climbing steadily in increments that matched almost exactly the transfer pattern I'd already started tracking in our joint accounts. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my own office building the afternoon that report finished loading, engine off, coffee going cold in the cup holder, and did the actual arithmetic for the first time, adding up every transfer I could account for across every account I now had visibility into, and the number that came back, even then, even before I understood the final total, was already past $22,000. I remember the specific physical sensation of that number arriving. Not anger yet, not even fully disbelief, something closer to the sensation of missing a stare in the dark, a lurch in the stomach before the mind catches up to explain what just happened to the body. $22,000, money I had watched us save dollar by careful dollar across 12 years of retirement contributions and a decade of birthday checks from her grandmother deposited instead of spent. Money that represented, in very literal terms, a meaningful fraction of the actual safety net standing between our family and disaster if either of us lost a job or got sick the way my mother had gotten sick. I did not go home angry that night, though I wanted to, and I think it is important to tell you honestly that wanting to and doing it are 2 very different things, and the gap between them for me, that particular week, was filled entirely with a kind of cold, methodical resolve that surprised even me. I decided I was not going to say one word to Denise until I understood the entire shape of what was happening. Not just the money, but who Adrian actually was, because some instinct, some old operations manager instinct for not acting on partial information, told me that the money alone did not tell the whole story, and that whatever I did next needed to be built on the complete picture, not a partial and possibly misleading fragment of it. I want to describe the night I finally got into the spare phone properly, because it is, without question, the single worst night of my adult life, worse even than the night my father died. In a strange and specific way I did not expect grief over a living, breathing marriage to be capable of matching. Denise had taken the kids to her sister's for a Friday sleepover, a standing monthly arrangement that gave her sister time with the kids and gave Denise, I now understand with a bitterness I am still working through, several uninterrupted hours to message a man who did not exist without any risk of a child wandering into the room. I stayed home that Friday citing a headache, which was not entirely a lie, and once the house was empty I sat down at the kitchen table with the spare phone, which I had finally guessed the passcode to 2 days earlier, our daughter Sophie's birthday, a detail that still guts me every time I think about it, because it meant that even in the middle of an active deception, some part of Denise had kept the door locked with a key made of our actual family. I read 5 months of messages in one sitting, start to finish, and I am not going to reproduce most of them here, because I think there is a line between telling this story honestly and simply putting my wife's most private, most humiliating words on display for strangers, and I have decided even now, even after everything, not to cross that line completely. But I will tell you what I learned, because it matters to everything that came after. I learned that Adrian Cole had told her, across those 5 months, that he loved her, specifically, using words I recognised because I had once used similar ones myself, early in our marriage, before life got complicated and tired and quiet, and reading a stranger's script deploy language that close to my own courtship was its own particular knife. I learned that he had asked her more than once to send not just money but photographs of herself, which she had, and which I understood with a sick lurch, meant that somewhere on a server I would never be able to reach, images of my wife existed as leverage in the hands of people who had already proven they would use anything available to extract more money from her. I learned the full financial picture, finally, in his own words as much as hers, a running tally of promises and repayments that would supposedly arrive any day now. A phrase that appeared, I counted later, 11 separate times across 5 months. And I learned, in the last 20 minutes of reading, the thing that turned this from a marriage crisis into something considerably more urgent, which was that 3 days earlier, Adrian had told her the inheritance, the business fortune, the one that was always about to arrive and repay everything and fund the porch in Charleston, had finally cleared a legal hold, but that releasing it to an American bank account required one final wire transfer fee, $14,000, routed through a maritime escrow agent, and that once that fee cleared, the full amount, which he described as just over $300,000, would transfer to her within 72 hours, and that this was, he told her, in a message timestamped 2 days before I read it, the very last thing he would ever need to ask of her. I promise you, my love, this ends it. We will never have to do this again. I sat at that kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, and I want to tell you honestly what I felt because I think it surprised me more than anything else in this entire story. I did not in that moment feel primarily like a betrayed husband. I felt like a man watching his wife walk toward a cliff edge in the dark, still convinced she was walking toward a doorway, and the feeling that rose up in me was not rage. Not yet. It was something closer to raw, animal urgency. The specific urgency of watching someone you love about to do something catastrophic and understanding that you have perhaps days, maybe only hours, to stop it before it becomes unstoppable. Because I had done the math on our accounts already, and I knew exactly how much was left in the joint retirement fund we had spent 12 years building, and I knew that $14,000, on top of what she had already moved through the personal line of credit, on top of what remained in her grandmother's account, on top of what she could still pull from that retirement fund if she decided the man she loved needed one final push, was a number that would not just hurt us. It would gut us for years, possibly for the rest of our working lives, in a way that a mortgage and 2 kids and a rebuilt sense of trust would have almost no chance of recovering from cleanly. I spent that entire weekend, while Denise was still at her sister's with the kids returning Sunday evening, doing 2 things simultaneously, and I want to walk through both of them, because I think the order and the reasoning matter enormously to what I eventually did. The first thing I did was call a college friend, Raymond Okafor, who's worked cybercrime and financial fraud cases for the FBI's field office in Philadelphia for the last 9 years, a friendship I had let go a little threadbare over the years the way you do with old friends from a different chapter of your life, but one that came roaring back to full strength the moment I called him at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning and said, "Ray, I need to ask you something, and I think it's an emergency, and I don't know who else to call." I told him everything, the messages, the money, the timeline, the $14,000 request still sitting unanswered, and Ray, to his enormous credit, did not waste one single minute making me feel foolish or asking why I hadn't caught it sooner. He said, "Marcus, listen to me carefully. This is a documented pattern. It's called a romance scam pig butchering operation. That specific phrase, pig butchering, comes from the way these operations fatten up a victim's trust and investment. Before the final slaughter, it is run almost always out of organised fraud compounds overseas, frequently staffed by trafficking victims themselves, forced to run these scripts under threat, and the account numbers you're describing, the LLC names, Alvarez Marine Logistics, Coastal Freight Solutions, those are almost certainly shell accounts that get closed and replaced every few weeks specifically to stay ahead of exactly the kind of bank fraud alerts that would otherwise catch this pattern. He told me, and this is the sentence that has stayed with me most clearly of anything anyone said to me that entire year, "Marcus, there is likely no getting the money back. I need you to hear that now from me, before you spend the next 6 months hoping otherwise. The recovery rate on these wires, once they clear international shell accounts, is close to zero. What you can do, starting today, is make sure there is no more money to lose." The second thing I did that weekend, running in parallel with everything Ray was telling me, was quietly, carefully, without telling a single other person besides Ray, begin the process of protecting what remained. I called our bank's fraud department Saturday afternoon, using the emergency line Ray had walked me through reaching, and explained calmly and factually that I had reason to believe a family member's account credentials might be compromised by a romance scam operation, and that I needed to understand my options as a joint account holder to prevent further unauthorized in spirit, if not unauthorized in law, transfers. I want to be precise about the legal reality here because it matters. Denise had not stolen this money from me. Her name was on every account she drew from, legally, completely, and nothing she had done, as devastating as it was, constituted fraud or theft in any way a bank or a court would recognize. What I was doing was not stopping a crime. It was exercising my equal legal right as a joint account holder to move funds I had equal legal claim to into a new account solely in my name, a move any bank will process for any account holder without requiring the other holder's permission or even their knowledge, precisely because joint accounts are built on the legal assumption of mutual trust that, in our case, had quietly stopped being true. I opened the new account Monday morning at a different bank entirely, one Denise had no relationship with and no reason to ever look for, using a business address, my mother's house, for the statements, and over the course of that week, carefully, in amounts small enough not to trigger the kind of large transfer notification our joint bank would send to both account holders by text message, I moved the entirety of what remained. Our joint retirement account, which still held just under $91,000 after 12 years of contributions. Our joint checking buffer, roughly $8,000 we kept for exactly the kind of emergency that, I remember thinking with a bleak private irony, we were currently living through, just not the kind either of us had ever imagined preparing for. I left, deliberately, enough in the joint checking account to cover the mortgage and the utilities and the ordinary weekly grocery run, because I did not want Denise to discover anything was wrong through the mundane channel of a bounced payment before I was ready to have the actual conversation, and because, whatever else was true, I did not want my children's electricity shut off in the middle of the worst month of their parents' marriage. I want to describe what those 11 days felt like, living in my own house, sleeping next to my wife, eating dinner across the table from her while Tyler complained about homework and Sophie explained at length a fact she'd learned about octopus camouflage, because I think it is the part of this story people understand least when I've described it to the small number of people who know the whole thing. I was not cold to her. I did not pull away or go quiet or give her any of the signals a guilty conscience or a wounded husband typically gives off, because I understood, with a clarity that frightened me a little at the time, that the moment she sensed something had changed, she would either accelerate whatever she was doing with Adrian, panicked, trying to save the relationship she still believed was real before I could interfere with it, or she would simply delete everything, the messages, the account records, the entire trail of evidence I would need if this ever became a conversation about what actually happened rather than a conversation about her word against a vague suspicion of mine. So I was, for 11 days, the same husband I'd been for the previous 18 months. Quiet, tired, present but not fully arrived, and I hated every single day of it, because it meant performing a version of normal with a woman I loved while holding a piece of knowledge that was actively rearranging everything I understood about our marriage. And I did not have one single person in my daily life to say any of it out loud to except Ray, who I called twice more that week, mostly just to hear another human voice confirm that I was not losing my mind. Ray helped me during those 11 days in ways beyond the initial advice, walking me through, over 2 more phone calls, how to document everything properly, screenshots of the messages time-stamped and backed up to a private cloud folder Denise had no access to, printed statements from every account showing the transfer pattern, a written timeline I built myself, night after night at my desk after Denise had gone to sleep, cross-referencing every payment against every message that had preceded it, because Ray told me, gently but firmly, whatever happens next in your marriage, Marcus, whether you stay or whether you don't, you're going to want an airtight record of exactly what happened, both for your own sake and because there is a non-zero chance, once this becomes visible, that these scam operations attempt to extort a second time, threatening to expose the messages or the photographs unless further payment is made, and you need to be ready for that too. That possibility, that this might not even be over once Denise learned the truth, sat in my stomach like a stone for the rest of that week. Ray also walked me through during one of those calls something I had not thought to consider at all, which was the question of whether Denise herself might be in some form of danger, not physical danger exactly, but a specific kind of psychological entrapment that Ray said he had seen escalate badly in a handful of his other cases, where a victim, confronted too abruptly or too publicly with the truth, experienced something closer to a genuine psychological crisis than an ordinary difficult conversation, the sudden collapse of a 5-month relationship that had felt entirely real, producing a grief reaction severe enough, in at least 2 cases Ray had personally worked, to require actual psychiatric intervention. He told me, Marcus, I need you to go into that kitchen table conversation, prepared for the possibility that this hits her harder than you expect, not because she's fragile, but because losing a relationship that felt real, even when it wasn't, activates the exact same grief circuitry as losing a real one, and you should have Dr. Nandakumar's number, or someone like her, ready before you have this conversation, not after. That single piece of advice is the reason I had already, before that Thursday afternoon, quietly researched and identified 3 marriage and trauma counsellors in our area who specialised in exactly this kind of situation. A list I kept folded in my wallet for 2 full weeks before we ever needed it, and I think having that list ready, having already done that specific piece of homework before the conversation, instead of scrambling to find help afterward in a moment of crisis, made a meaningful difference in how quickly we were able to get Denise into real, competent care once she needed it. I spent a considerable amount of those 11 days too, reading everything I could find about the psychology of these operations, not because I doubted what Ray was telling me, but because some part of me needed to understand it thoroughly enough to explain it convincingly to Denise later, rather than simply asserting it and hoping she believed me. I read academic papers on parasocial attachment and manufactured intimacy, technical breakdowns of exactly how these scripts are built and tested and refined across thousands of simultaneous conversations run by the same operation, a detail that struck me with particular horror. The idea that Adrian Cole's specific words to Denise, his account of his wife's death, his description of the porch in Charleston, were very likely not written in the moment at all, but pulled from a tested library of emotionally effective phrases that had already been used, with minor variations, on hundreds of other lonely women in hundreds of other small towns, refined over time the way a company refines advertising copy, testing which specific phrases produced the highest rate of financial compliance and discarding the ones that didn't. Learning that the tenderness Denise had experienced as uniquely, specifically hers, was in fact a tested, optimized script deployed at scale, did something strange to my own anger, redirecting a portion of it away from Denise entirely and toward an industrial-scale machine of manufactured intimacy that I had not previously understood existed at the scale it apparently does. I also spent part of those 11 days doing something that, in hindsight, I think was as much about managing my own fear as it was about genuinely useful preparation, which was quietly reviewing our entire financial picture beyond just the accounts Denise had touched. Because some part of me, in the rawest days of that discovery, became convinced, briefly and irrationally, that if this much had been hidden from me, everything might be compromised. Our mortgage, my own retirement contributions, insurance policies I hadn't reviewed in years. I spent one entire Sunday afternoon, while Denise was at her sister's again for an unrelated visit, going through literally every financial document in our house, mortgage statements, insurance paperwork, the kids' small custodial savings accounts, my own separate retirement account through my employer that Denise had never touched at all, and found, to my considerable relief, that the damage was contained precisely to the accounts I had already identified, the joint retirement fund, the joint checking buffer, her grandmother's inheritance account, and the personal line of credit she had opened without telling me. Nothing else had been touched. I remember sitting on our bedroom floor surrounded by folders at nearly midnight that Sunday, feeling something between relief and a strange, hollow exhaustion, understanding that the scope of the damage, while severe, was at least a knowable, bounded thing rather than an unknown quantity I would spend months still discovering pieces of. That Sunday audit mattered enormously to the conversation 4 days later, because it meant that when Denise asked me, at the kitchen table, "Is that everything? Is that the whole amount?" I was able to tell her, with complete confidence rather than a guess. Yes, this is the whole amount, $22,140, across 4 accounts over 5 months, and I watched something in her shoulders shift slightly at hearing a precise bounded number rather than an open-ended growing uncertainty. Because I think even in the middle of the worst conversation of her life, there was some small mercy in knowing the exact size of the wound rather than fearing it might still be larger than either of us yet understood. I want to say one more thing about Ray, because I think his role in this story deserves a proper close, rather than simply fading out of the narrative once the immediate crisis passed. Ray and Denise met in person for the first time about 6 months after the confrontation, at a barbecue at our house that had originally been planned as an ordinary early summer gathering before any of this happened, and that we decided deliberately to still hold, because Dr. Nandakumar had encouraged us to keep some ordinary rhythms of our life intact even in the middle of the harder work of rebuilding. Denise thanked Ray that afternoon, standing by our grill, in a voice that shook slightly, telling him she knew he had no obligation to help a friend he hadn't spoken to in years work through a crisis involving his friend's wife. And Ray told her something I had not expected, and that I think mattered enormously to Denise's own healing. He said, "Denise, I've worked cases like yours for 9 years, and I want you to understand something about how I see the people I work with. I do not see victims of these operations as foolish or weak. I see them as ordinary, decent people who got hunted by professionals, the same way I wouldn't call someone weak for getting mugged by someone bigger and better armed than they were. What happened to you was not a failure of your character. It was a crime committed against your character, specifically because your character, your loyalty, your empathy made you a target. I hope you can find your way to believing that eventually, even if it takes a while." Denise cried at her own barbecue hearing that, and I remember thinking, watching Ray hand her a paper towel from the stack by the grill with the same easy, unbothered kindness he'd shown on that very first Saturday phone call, that some friendships, even the ones you let go quiet for years, are simply waiting for the right crisis to prove they never actually went anywhere at all. I think, in the end, about how strange it is that a stolen photograph of a stranger in Sao Paulo, a man who will likely never know his face was used to nearly dismantle a family 4,000 miles away in a town he has never heard of, became the single most consequential accident of our entire marriage, more consequential, in its way, than either of our own choices at the very beginning, more consequential than the calculator I lent her across a community college classroom 16 years earlier, more consequential even than the actual wedding day itself. A total stranger's face, worn like a mask by people we will never meet and never properly hold accountable, walked into the specific gap my own silence had left open in my marriage, and very nearly took everything, and did take $22,000 we'll spend years finishing the work of replacing. I do not know how to make that fact feel smaller than it is, and I have stopped trying to. What I have done instead, over these 3 years, is let it sit alongside everything else true about our marriage. The good 14 years before it, the difficult 18 months that created the opening, the 5 months of the scam itself, and the 3 years since of slow, deliberate, unglamorous rebuilding, all of it true at once, none of it cancelling out any other part of it, which is, I've come to believe, simply what an honest marriage actually looks like once you strip away the performance of either perfect harmony or permanent damage that people so often expect a story like this one to resolve into. Denise asked me once, fairly recently, whether I thought people would judge her if this story were ever told beyond the small circle of people who already knew it, and I told her the truth, which is that some people certainly will, because it is easier to judge a stranger's mistake from a safe distance than to sit with the harder, more uncomfortable possibility that the exact same loneliness could open the exact same door in almost any long marriage, including their own, given the right combination of circumstances and the wrong stretch of silence. I told her I thought the judgment of strangers mattered considerably less than the actual lived truth of the people who know us, our children, my mother, Carol, Ray, Dr. Nanda Kumar, Harold Pruitt, all of whom watched the entire arc of this up close, and none of whom, not one single person who actually knows the whole story, walked away from us afterward. That, I told her, is the only jury verdict that has ever actually mattered to either of us, and it is the one I would stand behind completely 3 years later, telling this story to you now. This is our story, told as honestly and as completely as I know how to tell it. The story of a lonely stretch of silence in an otherwise good marriage, a stolen photograph and a script built to exploit exactly that silence, $22,000 that will not be coming back. 11 days I spent alone protecting what could still be protected, and 3 years of slow, deliberate work to become, again, two people who actually arrive in the same house together every single night. If any part of this reached you, if it reminded you of your own marriage, your own silence, your own loneliness, or your own family's finances that maybe deserve one more careful look tonight, then it has done exactly what we hoped telling it might do. Take care of the people in your own house tonight. Show up fully, especially on the hard nights. And if something in your own life doesn't quite add up, do not wait for certainty before you start protecting what still can be saved. The final crisis, the one Adrian had promised was the very last thing he would ever ask, arrived exactly on schedule on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after I'd finished moving the money, while I was helping Tyler with an algebra worksheet at the kitchen table, and Sophie was narrating an elaborate imaginary octopus civilization to nobody in particular from the living room floor. I watched Denise's face change. From across the kitchen, when she checked her phone at the counter, ostensibly checking a work email, and I watched her set down the dish towel she'd been holding a little too carefully, a little too deliberately, the specific stillness of a person trying very hard to look like they are not panicking. She told me she needed to run to the pharmacy, a lie so small and so ordinary I almost admired the craftsmanship of it, even in that moment, and I said, "Sure, take your time," and watched her walk out to the car with her phone already in her hand. I knew, because I had spent 11 days waiting for exactly this evening, what she was actually doing. She was sitting in our driveway, in the dark, trying to complete a wire transfer of $14,000 to release a fortune that did not exist, from a joint retirement account that no longer contained the money she believed was still there. I did not follow her outside. I sat at that kitchen table and helped Tyler factor quadratic equations, and some part of me, some part I am not entirely proud of, found a strange, cold satisfaction in the ordinariness of the moment. My son's pencil scratching against worksheet paper, my daughter's voice explaining Octopus Society to an audience of stuffed animals, while 40 feet away, in a car in our own driveway, a lie 11 days in the making was finally, quietly, running into a wall it did not know was there. She came back inside 18 minutes later, and I want to describe her face when she walked through that door, because it is an expression I had genuinely never seen on my wife in 16 years of marriage. Not during either of her father's 2 heart surgeries, not during the week we thought Sophie might have a serious kidney condition before the follow-up test came back clear, not during any hardship either of us had weathered together before. It was the specific ashen stillness of a person whose entire internal architecture has just failed at once, and she moved through the kitchen like someone walking on a floor she no longer trusted to hold her weight. And when I asked gently, "Is everything okay at the pharmacy?" she said, "Fine. They were out of my prescription. I'll go back tomorrow," in a voice with absolutely none of the smoothness of the retirement card life 4 months earlier. A voice that was, for the first time in this entire story, visibly, audibly, cracking under its own weight. I did not confront her that night, and I want to explain the final piece of reasoning behind that choice, because it is the piece I have had to defend most since. I had already moved the money. I had already stopped the bleeding, in the only way that actually mattered, the practical financial way. What remained now was not an emergency requiring immediate action. It was a conversation requiring the right conditions, and I did not want that conversation to happen at 10 o'clock at night with our children asleep down the hall, overhearing whatever came out of either of our mouths in the rawest, least controlled version of this discovery. I wanted, and I say this without any embarrassment, one more day to make absolutely sure my own reaction, when it finally came, would be something I could stand behind for the rest of my life, rather than something said in the first white-hot minute of confirmed betrayal that I might spend years trying to walk back. I arranged, the next morning, for my mother's home health aide to take the kids for the afternoon after school, a Thursday, telling Denise only that I'd asked my mother's aide to help out so the two of us could talk about something important, a sentence vague enough that Denise, already frayed and frightened from whatever had happened in that driveway the night before, went pale in a way she tried and failed to hide. I came home from work at 2 that afternoon instead of 5, and I sat down at our kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten 16 years of dinners and helped with 1,000 homework assignments, and 3 days earlier, where I had helped Tyler factor quadratic equations 40 feet from a lie collapsing in our driveway, and I laid out in a plain manila folder I had assembled over the previous 11 days every printed statement, every screenshot, every dollar figure, organized by date, in the same methodical format I would use for a supplier audit at work, because I did not trust myself in that moment to speak entirely from feeling without something solid in front of both of us to anchor the conversation in fact rather than accusation. Denise came into the kitchen at 2:15, and I watched her see the folder before she saw my face, and I watched something in her shoulders drop, not in relief, in the specific collapse of a person who has just understood all at once that the thing they have been quietly terrified of for 11 days has finally, actually arrived. She sat down across from me without being asked, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all, and I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming, absurdly loud in that silence, the way ordinary household sounds get loud in the exact moments you most wish the world would simply stop making noise. I said, "Finally, his name is not Adrian Cole." She flinched physically like I had touched a burn and said, "Marcus," and I said, "Let me finish, please. I need to say this whole thing once, all the way through, before either of us says anything else. His name is not Adrian Cole. The photographs are not his. He is not a marine logistics consultant. He does not own a ship. His wife did not die of ovarian cancer because he does not have a wife, because he is not, in all likelihood, one single person at all, but is probably a script, run by an organized group, very possibly overseas, that has done this exact thing, with these exact stories. The container in Lagos, the sick sailor, the inheritance that's always about to clear, to thousands of women in thousands of towns exactly like ours. I opened the folder and turned it toward her, and I watched her read the top page, a printed statement showing the first $800 transfer, and I watched her hand come up to cover her mouth, slowly, the way you'd cover a wound you didn't want to look at directly. She said, "How long have you known?" in a voice barely above a whisper, and I told her, 11 days, since the Friday you took the kids to your sister's, and I watched that land, watched her do the math in real time, realizing that every dinner, every ordinary evening, every moment of the previous 11 days that she had experienced as an increasingly desperate secret she was keeping from me, had actually been a period where I already knew everything, and had said nothing, and I want to be honest that I watched something like a second wave of shock move through her at that realization, almost separate from the shock of the scam itself, the shock of understanding that I had watched her, closely, for nearly 2 weeks while she believed herself still invisible. She asked, "Are you leaving me?" And I told her the truth, which was, "I don't know yet, Denise. I genuinely don't know yet. And I need you to not ask me that question again until I've had time to actually find out the answer. Because if I answer it right now, in this exact minute, I don't trust the answer I'd give you, and I don't think you should trust it either." She nodded, and then she asked the question I had been dreading most, the one I did not have a clean answer for even after 11 days of preparing for this conversation. She asked, "Did you ever love him?" Meaning, did I understand that whatever she felt for the version of Adrian that existed only in her own mind was, to her, indistinguishable from something real? And I told her, "Honestly, I don't know what to call what you felt, Denise, and I'm not going to pretend I do, but I need you to understand something clearly right now. Whatever you felt, you were feeling it for a person who does not exist, and every single thing he told you, his wife, his ship, his loneliness, his love, all of it was written by someone or some group of people running a calculated financial operation against you, the same way they've run it against thousands of other people, and none of it, not one word of it, was ever actually about you specifically, even though it was engineered to feel like the most specifically about you thing that had happened to you in years." She started crying then, not the composed, contained crying of someone managing an emotion in front of another person, but the specific, ugly, full-body crying of someone whose entire understanding of the last 5 months has just been demolished in real time, and I sat there and let her cry because I did not know what else to do, and because some part of me, even in the middle of my own devastation, recognized that she was not only grieving the discovery of a scam, she was grieving the actual specific loss of a relationship that had felt, to her for 5 months, like the realest thing in her life, and the fact that it had never been real did not make the grief for it any less physically real in her body in that exact moment. When she could speak again, she told me the whole thing, start to finish, in a voice that kept breaking and rebuilding itself every few sentences, the watercolour compliment, the loneliness she had been carrying since my mother's stroke started eating our evenings, the specific way Adrian had asked about her day and actually seemed to remember the answer the following week, a detail she said through fresh tears. He remembered things you'd stopped asking about, Marcus, and I know that's not an excuse. I know it's not, but I need you to understand it's not nothing either, and I sat with that sentence for a long moment before I answered it, because I think it is the truest and hardest thing she said that entire afternoon. I told her, and I meant every word of it, you're right, it's not nothing. I stopped arriving in this house a 1.5 years ago, I know that. You told me that once already in a different way, and I didn't hear it properly then either. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that my silence caused this, because you made choices, real choices. Choices that cost this family $22,000 we spent 12 years saving, and choices you made alone, without telling me, for 5 months are yours to own regardless of how lonely you were when you made them. But I'm also not going to sit here and pretend I was some innocent bystander in a marriage that had gone quiet enough for a stranger's stolen photograph to feel like more attention than your own husband was giving you. Both of those things are true at the same time, Denise. I need you to hear that I understand both of those things are true at the same time, because I've spent 11 days making sure I understood that before I ever sat down at this table. She asked, then, the question that I think mattered most to her in that moment. More than the money, more than the humiliation of having been fooled, more even than the fear of what came next for us. She asked, why didn't you just yell at me? Why didn't you scream? Why did you just quietly move the money and wait 11 days? And I told her, because I needed you to still have something left, Denise. If I had confronted you the night I found that message, you would have panicked. And panic makes people either destroy evidence or double down trying to save what they still believed was real. And either way, we would have lost more than we already lost. And our kids would have watched their parents fall apart in real time with no floor left underneath any of us. I moved the money to stop the bleeding. I waited to have this conversation because I wanted to have it once, completely, with everything laid out, instead of in 5 separate screaming matches over 5 separate weeks as more information kept surfacing. I am not telling you this to make myself sound noble, Denise. I am telling you because it is the actual truth of what I was thinking, and because you asked and I promised myself walking into this conversation that I would not lie to you today, of all days, no matter how much smaller a lie might have felt in the moment. We talked for almost 4 hours that afternoon, long past when the kids were supposed to come home, a delay I had arranged in advance with the aide for exactly this reason, and I'm not going to walk through every single minute of those 4 hours, because some of it was simply the two of us saying the same painful things in slightly different words, circling the same wound from different angles the way people do when a single conversation cannot possibly hold the entire weight of what needs to be said. But there were a few more moments in those 4 hours I think matter enough to tell you about directly, because they shaped everything that came after. At one point, close to an hour in, Denise asked me whether I had told anyone else, and I told her about Ray, carefully, explaining that I had needed someone who actually understood financial fraud to tell me what our real options were, and that Ray had been very clear the money itself was almost certainly unrecoverable. And I watched her absorb that piece of news, the confirmation that $22,000 was simply gone, with a specific kind of grief that was almost separate from the grief over Adrian, a grief over her own judgment, her own carefulness with money that she had prided herself on for her entire adult life, the same carefulness that had made her good at managing an inheritance account, and good at running the billing systems at her office. All of it apparently no match for a script built specifically to defeat exactly that kind of careful, responsible person. She asked whether we needed to report it to the police, and I told her Ray had already walked me through that too, that yes, we should file a report, both with local police and with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, not because there was any realistic chance of recovering the money, but because every single report filed helps investigators build the pattern data that occasionally, eventually, leads to an actual prosecution or an actual platform shutting down an operation, and because, Ray had told me directly, there is a real possibility, once financial institutions and platforms flag a victim's accounts and information, that the same operation or an affiliated one attempts to make contact again down the road under a different name. And having an official record in place from the beginning makes it considerably easier to prove a pattern if that happens, Denise asked, near the end of those 4 hours, in a voice quieter than almost anything else she'd said that day, whether I thought she was a stupid person, and I told her something I had actually thought through carefully during those 11 days of waiting, because I knew she would ask some version of this question eventually. I said, Denise, I have read about this since I found out more than I ever wanted to know about how these operations actually work. And the thing that surprised me most is that the people who fall for them are not, on average, less intelligent or less careful than anyone else. If anything, the data Ray showed me suggests the opposite, that people with real empathy, real conscientiousness, real capacity for loyalty, the exact qualities that make you good at your job and good as a mother and good as a partner when things are actually going well between us, are the specific qualities these operations are engineered to exploit, because a person incapable of that kind of loyalty and empathy would have hung up on Adrian in the second week. You weren't stupid. You were lonely and you were kind in a way that got pointed like a weapon by people who study exactly that kindness for a living. That doesn't erase what it cost us. But it's not the same thing as stupid, and I need you to actually hear the difference, because I think you're going to spend a long time being cruel to yourself about this if you don't. I want to tell you honestly that I did not, in that conversation, forgive her. Not fully, not in the way people mean when they use that word casually. What I did was something narrower and, I think, more honest, which was agree to find out together over time whether the marriage underneath this specific catastrophe still had enough left in it to be worth rebuilding. A question neither of us could actually answer in a single Thursday afternoon, no matter how many hours we spent trying. The kids came home around 6:30 that evening, and I want to describe that specific transition because it is one of the strangest things about a crisis like this, the way ordinary domestic life simply keeps demanding its due regardless of what has just detonated in the room an hour earlier. Sophie ran in describing at length a new octopus fact she'd learned at the AIDS house, involving something about ink clouds, and Tyler grunted something approximating a greeting and disappeared toward his room, and Denise and I looked at each other across the kitchen, both of us with faces that had clearly been crying for hours and made the specific, practiced adjustment that parents learn to make, folding an entire devastating afternoon into a small enough shape to set aside for 90 minutes of dinner and homework and bedtime stories. A skill I am not sure is healthy in the long run, but that felt, that particular night, like the only thing holding the four of us together. The following week, we filed the reports Ray had recommended, first with the Ashford Falls Police Department, where a patient, weary detective named Sergeant Colette Vance took a full statement from both of us and told us, gently but without any sugarcoating, almost exactly what Ray had already prepared us to hear, that local police have almost no jurisdiction or capability to pursue money that has already crossed into international shell accounts, but that the report itself matters, both for our own records and for a growing federal database tracking exactly this kind of operation. We filed a second, more detailed report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, uploading every screenshot, every account number, every dollar figure, a process that took most of a Saturday afternoon and that Denise insisted on doing herself, sitting at the kitchen table typing out the entire 5-month timeline in her own words, a task I think she needed to do alone, a specific act of taking ownership of the story rather than letting it remain something that had simply happened to her. 3 weeks after the confrontation, the second crisis Ray had warned us about arrived almost exactly the way he predicted it would. Denise received a message, not from Adrian's old account, which had gone silent the moment the final wire failed to arrive, but from an entirely new profile, a woman this time, claiming to be a recovery specialist who had, quote, identified Denise's case among a database of scam victims and could help recover the lost funds for an upfront processing fee of $2,000. This is, Ray told us when we called him immediately, a second-stage scam that specifically targets people who have already been victimized once, betting correctly that a person desperate to undo a catastrophic loss is an easier mark the second time than the first, precisely because the desire to fix the original mistake overrides the caution that should, in theory, have been earned the hard way. Denise did not send a single dollar. She screenshotted the message, forwarded it to the same FBI complaint database, and blocked the account, and I remember feeling, watching her do that, calmly and without panic, the first genuine flicker of something like pride in how she was handling the aftermath. A small thing, but the first small thing in weeks that felt like progress instead of damage control. I need to tell you about a conversation I had with my brother Andrew during this same period, because it represents a kind of pressure I had not anticipated and had to think through carefully. Andrew, who lives in Arizona and, as I mentioned, calls our mother twice a year, called me the week after the confrontation, having heard a partial, garbled version of events from our mother, who I had told a carefully limited version of the story to explain why I'd needed her aid to watch the kids that Thursday. Andrew's reaction was immediate and forceful in a direction I had not expected. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that I was a fool for staying even one more night in that house, that any woman who sends $22,000 to a man she's never met has revealed something fundamental and unfixable about her judgment and her loyalty, and that I was, in his exact words, letting 12 years of marriage and some vague sense of fairness cloud a decision that should have been obvious the moment I read that first message. I want to describe how I responded to Andrew, because I think it clarifies something important about the specific position I found myself in during those weeks, caught between people who wanted me to react faster and harder than I was reacting, and my own private conviction that the slower, more deliberate path was the right one for my specific family, even if it was not the path everyone else would have chosen. I told Andrew, I appreciate that you're angry on my behalf. I really do. But you weren't in this marriage for the 18 months before this happened, and you don't know what I know about exactly how and why this specific woman, who's been an excellent mother and an honest partner for 14 years before this, ended up vulnerable to exactly this specific kind of manipulation. I'm not deciding to stay because I'm weak or because I haven't thought it through. I'm deciding to take the time to actually find out whether this marriage can be rebuilt, with real information instead of a gut reaction, and if it turns out it can't be rebuilt, I will make that decision on my own timeline, based on what I actually observe over the coming months, not based on how fast you think I should be moving. He didn't fully agree with me, and our relationship stayed a little strained through the following months, but I have never once regretted saying that to him, because I think it was the truest thing I said to anyone outside my own marriage during that entire period. Tyler, our 14-year-old, found out more than we intended him to find out, not through us, but through the specific merciless information network that exists among teenagers whose parents know each other, in this case through a classmate whose mother worked in the billing office with Denise and had apparently overheard enough hallway conversation to piece together a garbled, exaggerated version of events that reached Tyler in the school cafeteria 3 weeks after the confrontation, in the specific cruel shorthand that travels between 14-year-olds. Is it true your mum gave all your family's money to some guy online? I found out about this the hard way, coming home to find Tyler had locked himself in his room and would not come out for dinner, and it took the better part of 2 hours sitting on the floor outside his closed door to get him to open it at all. That conversation with Tyler is one I think about often, maybe as often as the conversation with Denise herself, because I had to figure out, in real time, with no preparation, how to tell a 14-year-old the truth about his mother without either protecting her so completely that he stopped trusting anything I said, or condemning her so completely that I handed him a version of his own mother he would carry resentfully for years. I told him, sitting on his bedroom floor while he stared at the wall refusing to look at me, "Your mum made a serious mistake, Tyler, a real one that cost this family a lot of money and a lot of trust, and I'm not going to pretend to you that it didn't happen, or that it doesn't matter, because you're old enough now that lying to you about something this size would be its own kind of betrayal. But I also need you to understand that people aren't just the worst thing they've ever done, any more than they're just the best thing they've ever done. Your mum has been a good mother to you for 14 years, every single day, and she also did this one specific, real, damaging thing during a hard stretch of time when she was lonelier than either of us realized. Both of those things are true. I'm working through what that means for us as a family, and it's going to take time, and I need you to give me and your mum the space to work through it without you deciding, at 14, that you already know exactly how the whole story ends." Tyler asked me, finally turning to look at me, "Are you getting divorced?" The question every kid in this situation eventually asks, and I gave him the same honest answer I had given Denise weeks earlier. I don't know yet, buddy. I'm not going to pretend I know something. I don't know just to make tonight easier. What I do know is that whatever happens, you and Sophie are the two most important people in this, and both of us, your mom and me both, are going to make sure you're taken care of no matter what we decide about us. It was not a satisfying answer for a 14-year-old who wanted certainty, and I could see that on his face, but I have never regretted choosing honesty over false comfort with my own son, even when the honesty was harder to sit with for both of us. Denise's sister, Carol, and I should clarify, since her name has already appeared once in this story attached to a fictitious retirement party, that the actual Carol, Denise's older sister, is a different person entirely from the invented co-worker whose name Denise had borrowed for that early lie. A detail that became its own small, strange source of dark comedy between us months later. When Denise admitted she grabbed the first name that came to mind that night and it happened to be her own sister's, entirely by coincidence, without any deeper meaning behind it. The real Carol, once she learned what had happened. Several weeks after the confrontation, when Denise finally told her the whole story during one of their regular Sunday phone calls, reacted with a mixture of fury at the scammers and fierce, unwavering support for her sister that surprised me, given that Carol had never been shy about criticizing Denise for smaller things over the years. Carol told Denise something that Denise later repeated to me word for word because she said it had mattered enormously to her in a week when she was struggling to find any reason to be gentle with herself. Carol said, "Denise, I've known you our whole lives, and I know exactly how hard you've worked to be dependable for everyone around you, your kids, your husband, your patients at that office, and I think somewhere in the middle of taking care of everyone else you forgot it was allowed to feel good when someone paid attention to you specifically, and a predator found that gap and used it, and that is not the same thing as you being a fundamentally foolish or unfaithful person. It doesn't erase the damage, but you are allowed to hold both truths at once, and so is Marcus, and so is anyone judging you from the outside who has never actually had someone study their exact loneliness for a living." We started marriage counselling 5 weeks after the confrontation with a therapist named Dr. Priyanandakumar who specialised, we discovered through Ray's wife, who had recommended her, in exactly this kind of financial infidelity and scam-related betrayal, a specialisation I did not know existed as a category until we needed it, and one of the first things Dr. Nandakumar told us, in our very first joint session, reframed the entire situation for me in a way I found genuinely useful. She said, "I want both of you to understand something before we start doing the harder work of rebuilding trust here. What happened is real, and it counts, and I am not going to spend our sessions minimizing the financial and emotional damage of what occurred. But I also want you both to understand that a scam of this specific type functions less like an ordinary affair and more like an assault carried out by trained professionals against a specific vulnerability, and part of my job here is to help both of you hold Denise accountable for the choices she made, while also correctly locating a meaningful portion of the actual harm on the people who built and ran this operation deliberately to exploit exactly this kind of loneliness. Both things matter. Neither one erases the other. Those sessions over the following 4 months were some of the hardest, most necessary conversations of our marriage, and I am not going to walk through all of them, because I think the specific content of marriage counselling belongs mostly to the two people in the room, but I want to tell you about 2 moments that mattered enormously to where we eventually landed. In the 6th session, Dr. Nandakumar asked me directly whether I had fully forgiven Denise, and I told her, honestly, no, not fully, and I don't know if I ever will completely, and I don't think that's necessarily the goal. What I have done is decide that the version of Denise who exists across 16 years, the one who nursed both our kids through fevers at 3 in the morning, the one who drove 4 hours each way to sit with my mother in the hospital the week of her stroke without being asked, the one who has been honest and present and loving in every other measurable way for 14 years before this happened, is a real person who deserves the chance to rebuild something, alongside the much smaller, much more painful truth that for 5 specific months she was also someone who lied to me repeatedly and moved $22,000 of our family's money toward a man who did not exist. I am choosing every day to hold both of those facts as true at the same time, and some days that choice is easier than others. In the 9th session, Denise said something I had not fully understood until she said it out loud in that room, which was that the hardest part of the recovery for her was not the financial loss, devastating as that was, and not even the shame of having been fooled, but the specific, ongoing grief of losing a relationship that had, for 5 months, felt like the realest emotional connection she'd had in over a year, and having nowhere legitimate to put that grief, because you cannot mourn a person who never existed the way you mourn an actual loss, and yet the feelings the fake relationship had produced in her were entirely physically real and did not simply evaporate the moment the fraud was exposed. Dr. Nandakumar helped her work through that specific grief as its own distinct thing, separate from the guilt over the money and separate from the fear of losing her actual marriage. And watching Denise do that work, over those months, slowly stop flinching every time Adrian's name came up in conversation, was its own strange kind of relief for me, because it meant she was actually processing what had happened instead of simply burying it under shame and moving forward on the surface while something rotted quietly underneath. I want to tell you about a specific afternoon, about 4 months after the confrontation, that I think represents the turning point in our actual rebuilding, more than any single therapy session did. Denise came home from work and told me she'd spent her lunch break that day writing a long message to a stranger, a woman she'd found through a support forum for romance scam victims that Ray had pointed us toward, a woman in Nebraska who had lost considerably more than we had, nearly $70,000 to a nearly identical operation, using a different stolen identity, a supposed oil rig engineer this time instead of a marine logistics consultant, and Denise told me she had spent an hour writing to this stranger, not offering advice exactly, because she said she didn't feel qualified to advise anyone on anything yet, but simply telling her, "You are not stupid, and what happened to you was not your fault in the way it feels like it must have been, and I promise you the shame gets slightly more bearable, even if it never fully disappears." Denise cried telling me about writing that message, and I understood, watching her, that something important had shifted, that she had moved from being a person purely inside her own catastrophe to a person capable of reaching outward from it to help someone else standing where she had stood 4 months earlier. And I think that shift, more than anything, Dr. Nandakumar said in any session, is what allowed me to actually begin trusting the process of rebuilding instead of just enduring it. I need to walk through the practical, financial reality of the following year, because I think people who have not lived through this specific kind of loss underestimate how long the actual recovery takes, in dollars and cents terms, separate entirely from the emotional recovery. $22,000 pulled from a retirement account that had taken 12 years to build does not simply get replaced by deciding to save harder for a few months. Ray had been right from the very first phone call that the money itself was gone, and 6 months of intermittent follow-up with the FBI's complaint unit confirmed exactly that, a case agent named Special Agent Dana Whitcomb telling us, in a call I will remember for its careful, weary kindness, that our case had in fact been folded into a larger pattern investigation involving over 400 identified victims connected to the same cluster of shell accounts, Alvarez Marine Logistics among them, but that the operation appeared to be based overseas in a jurisdiction with limited cooperation on financial crime extradition, and that while the pattern data we'd provided was genuinely useful to the broader investigation, she could not offer us any realistic timeline or likelihood of financial recovery, and encouraged us instead to focus our energy on rebuilding rather than waiting on a process that might take years and might never conclude with restitution at all. We sat down, Denise and I, about 5 months after the confrontation, and did the same kind of kitchen table math we used to do during the lean years early in our marriage. Except this time the math was about repair instead of survival. We recalculated our retirement timeline, and the honest answer, one neither of us enjoyed hearing from the financial advisor we consulted, a careful, unsentimental woman named Beatrice Alsop, who Ray had also recommended, was that the $22,000 loss, compounded over the 16 years remaining until my planned retirement age, represented closer to $60,000 in lost future growth, a number that made Denise go quiet for a long moment, when Beatrice said it out loud in her office, and that recovering that ground would require both of us increasing our retirement contributions by an amount that would meaningfully tighten our monthly budget for at least the next several years. Denise, without my even asking, took on additional billing consulting work 2 evenings a week for a second orthopedic practice across the county, work she found through a colleague, specifically, she told me, so that money would go directly and visibly into rebuilding what she had cost us, a decision I did not ask her to make, but that mattered enormously to me when she made it unprompted. I want to describe a specific evening, about 7 months after the confrontation, because I think it represents something important about how trust actually gets rebuilt, in small, unglamorous increments rather than one dramatic gesture. Denise had started, on her own initiative, a habit of showing me her phone, unprompted, not because I had demanded it. We had specifically agreed in therapy that a marriage built on permanent surveillance was not actually a marriage worth rebuilding, but because she said she wanted transparency to be something she offered rather than something extracted from her, a distinction Dr. Nanda Kumar had helped her articulate, and that I found, when she actually lived it out consistently over months, rather than just saying it once in a session, more convincing than any single apology could have been. One evening in that 7th month, she got a message from a new number, a wrong number as it turned out, someone looking for a plumbing contractor, and instead of just deleting it the way anyone normally would, she turned her phone around and showed me before she'd even fully read it, a reflex by then, rather than a performance, and I remember laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in a long time about something connected to her phone, and telling her, "Denise, I don't need to see every wrong number you get for the rest of your life," and she said, "I know, but I want you to see that I want you to see it, if that makes sense." And it did make sense, more sense than almost anything else she'd said in the entire process. I also want to tell you about a moment that tested us, because I think a story like this is not honest if it only shows the moments where things got steadily, uncomplicatedly better. About 9 months after the confrontation, I came across, entirely by accident, doing some unrelated tax paperwork, a folder of old messages Denise had saved, screenshots actually, of some of the earliest conversations with Adrian, the watercolour compliments, the early gentle check-ins, saved not out of any current attachment, she explained later, near tears, but because Dr. Nanda Kumar had suggested keeping a record for the ongoing FBI case, and Denise had simply never deleted the folder afterward. I felt something sharp and ugly move through me, seeing those messages again, unexpectedly. A full year's worth of careful healing suddenly feeling fragile in the space of about 90 seconds. And I did something I'm not proud of, which was walk out of the house without telling her where I was going, and drive around for 2 hours before I came back, not trusting myself to say anything productive in that first wave of resurfaced anger. When I came back, Denise was sitting at the kitchen table, clearly having spent those 2 hours frightened I might not come back at all, and I told her honestly, I'm not angry that the folder exists, I understand why it exists. I got angry because for about 90 seconds it felt like the last year hadn't actually happened, like I was back at that exact kitchen table 11 months ago finding out for the first time, and I needed to physically leave the house until that feeling passed instead of saying something out of it I couldn't take back. She told me, quietly, "That's fair, and can I ask you something?" And I said yes, and she asked, "Does that mean this is always going to be able to knock you back down like that, even years from now?" And I told her the honest answer, which was, "I don't know, Denise. I think some version of that risk is just permanently part of what happened to us now, the same way my mother's stroke is permanently part of our story, even years after she stabilised. I don't think the goal is for it to never hurt again. I think the goal is for the bad moments to get further apart and shorter, and I think, if I'm honest, that's exactly what's been happening this whole year, even with today being a setback." Around the 1-year mark, something happened that I did not expect, and that ended up mattering more than almost anything else in this entire story. Special Agent Whitcomb called again, this time with actual news rather than the careful, managed disappointment of previous updates. The broader pattern investigation involving the Shell account cluster had led, through cooperation with a financial institution in Southeast Asia that had begun freezing suspicious accounts under new anti-fraud regulations, to the identification and seizure of a portion of the network's holding accounts. And while she was careful to caution us twice not to expect anything close to full restitution, our specific case was eligible for a partial recovery through a federal victim restitution fund, being established as the broader case moved toward prosecution of several individuals identified as operating the technical infrastructure from outside the country. The amount, when the paperwork finally cleared 8 months later, came to just under $6,000, a fraction of what we'd lost, nowhere close to making us whole. But I want to describe what receiving that check actually felt like, because it was not really about the money at all by that point. It felt like an official acknowledgement from an institution with actual investigative authority that what had happened to us was real, was a crime, was something done to us by identifiable people who are now in some small measure being held to account, and Denise cried when that letter arrived. Not from relief about the money, but she told me because it was the first time since the whole thing started that she felt like the story had an ending that wasn't purely about her own shame, an ending that included, even in a small way, actual consequences for the actual people who had built the whole operation. I want to tell you about Denise's decision, about 14 months after the confrontation, to speak anonymously to a local news reporter doing a series on romance scams targeting the region, a decision she came to entirely on her own, and discussed with me only after she'd already agreed to it. She spoke by phone, her voice altered and her name withheld in the published piece, describing the watercolour forum, the stolen photographs, the 5 months, the $22,000, and the specific mechanism of loneliness that had made her vulnerable. And she told me afterward that doing it had felt like taking the worst 5 months of her life and turning them into something that might stop even one other lonely person in Ashford Falls from sending the first $40 for an international data plan that didn't exist. The piece ran, anonymous as promised, and Denise showed it to Carol and to Dr. Nandakumar and to nobody else. A small private act of turning a wound into something with a use beyond her own healing, and I remember reading it myself and recognizing in the careful, anonymized language my own wife's voice underneath it, and feeling, for the first time in over a year, something closer to pride than grief when I thought about the whole ordeal. There is one more piece of this story I need to tell you, because I think it completes the picture of where Denise and I actually landed, and it involves a conversation we had, just the two of us, on our 17th wedding anniversary, roughly 10 months after the confrontation, sitting on the back porch of our house after the kids had gone to bed, the same kind of ordinary Tuesday evening quiet that had, in a different form, once made room for a lonely woman to start talking to a stranger about watercolours. I asked Denise directly whether she thought we would have gotten here, to this specific porch, this specific conversation, without what had happened, and she thought about it for a long time before answering, longer than she usually took to answer anything, and said, "Honestly, Marcus, I think we would have kept drifting. I think you would have kept disappearing into your mother's care and calling it strength, and I think I would have kept being quietly lonely and calling it just being tired, and I think we might have woken up in 5 years as two people who technically stayed married but had actually stopped being a marriage a long time before anyone said it out loud. I'm not saying I'm grateful for what happened, because I'm not. I would undo every single day of those 5 months if I could, and I would undo the $22,000 in a heartbeat. But I don't think I'm sorry we're having this conversation now instead of 5 years from now, after even more had quietly eroded without either of us noticing. I told her that evening something I had been sitting with for months and hadn't fully said out loud yet, which was that I had come to understand my own silence during my mother's decline as its own kind of failure, not an excuse for what Denise had done. The two things were never equivalent, and I was careful, that whole conversation, not to let them collapse into each other as though her $22,000 mistake and my 18 months of quiet withdrawal were somehow the same size of wrong. They were not. And I want to be honest about that distinction even now telling you this story. But I told her that I had learned something true about myself in this whole ordeal too, which was that arriving, actually, fully arriving, in your own marriage on the hard nights, not just the easy ones, is not optional maintenance you can skip during a difficult season and pick back up later without cost. It has a cost. Ours turned out to be $22,000 and nearly our whole marriage, and I told her I did not ever want to learn that particular lesson again by nearly losing something to relearn it. I want to go back and tell you more about Ray, because his role in this story deserves more than the handful of phone calls I've already described, and because something happened between us over the course of that first year that I think matters to the larger picture. Ray had, in the 9 years since we'd let our friendship go a little threadbare, worked dozens of cases involving exactly this kind of romance fraud, and about 6 months after our initial crisis, over beers at a bar halfway between Ashford Falls and Philadelphia, he told me something that reframed the entire operation for me in a way that has stuck with me since. He said, "Marcus, you want to know the thing that actually keeps me up at night about these cases, more than the money, more than the victims even. It's that a meaningful number of the people actually typing these messages, actually running the script against your wife night after night for 5 months, are themselves victims, trafficked into compounds in Southeast Asia under false job promises, testing centres or customer service jobs advertised online, and then held there, phones and passports confiscated, forced to run these exact romance scam scripts against people like Denise under threat of violence, unable to leave, sometimes for years. He told me it does not make what happened to Denise any less real or any less damaging, and it does not mean the people at the very top of these operations, the ones who built the scripts and structured the shell accounts and profit from the whole machine, deserve 1 ounce less accountability. But he said, I want you to understand, if it ever comes up, that the person who spent 5 months telling your wife he loved her may well have been someone typing those words at gunpoint, essentially, in a locked compound, hating every message as much as any of us would hate being forced to write it. And that particular knowledge, once I sat with it, complicated my anger in a way I had not expected, adding a whole additional layer of horror to the situation that had nothing to do with Denise at all, and everything to do with the sheer scale of human suffering apparently required to produce one fake message about a container stuck in a port in Lagos. I told Denise about that conversation with Ray a few days later, and I watched her go very quiet, and then she said something I think is one of the wisest things she said in that entire first year, which was, Marcus, I don't know if that makes it better or worse, honestly. Some days it makes me feel less foolish, knowing there might have been an actual desperate person on the other end forced into this, the same way I was forced into my own kind of desperation by being lonely for a year and a half. And some days it makes me feel sick in a completely different way, because it means an entire system of real human suffering was built specifically to manufacture the exact feeling I mistook for love. And I don't know what to do with a sadness that big except let it exist alongside everything else I'm already carrying. I want to tell you about Tyler's 15th birthday, which fell about 14 months after the confrontation, because it represents, more than almost anything else, the specific texture of what an ordinary family looks like, while quietly still rebuilding itself underneath the surface of ordinary life. We had a small party, a handful of his friends, a homemade cake Denise insisted on making herself, despite her genuinely mediocre baking skills, a fact the whole family teases her about affectionately to this day. And at one point that afternoon, Tyler, who had grown considerably more talkative with me over the preceding year, not fully back to the boy who used to tell me everything but noticeably more present than the closed-door teenager he'd become before all this, pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, quietly, almost embarrassed, Hey, I just wanted to say, things feel normal again, like actually normal, not fake normal, and I wanted you to know I noticed. I did not expect a 15-year-old to say something that emotionally precise to me unprompted, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom for a minute afterward, because I did not want my son to see his father cry over a sentence about birthday cake and normalcy, though in hindsight I think it might have been fine if he had. Sophie, who was 10 by then, asked me a question around this same time that I think about often, sitting in the car on the way home from her swim lesson, apropos of nothing, the way 10-year-olds ask their biggest questions, whether Mum and I were going to stay married forever now, and I told her, as honestly as I could manage for a 10-year-old sweetheart, nobody can promise forever, not really, but I can tell you that your mum and I are working really hard every single day to stay married, and that the work is going well, and that I love her, and she loves me, and we both love you and your brother more than anything in the world, and that's about as close to a real promise as any honest parent can actually make. She seemed satisfied with that answer, in the specific, uncomplicated way children are satisfied with honest answers, even when those answers do not contain absolute certainty. And she went back to describing, at considerable length, a documentary about octopus intelligence she'd watched at school that week, and I remember driving the rest of the way home with the specific, quiet gratitude of a father whose daughter's biggest concern that afternoon was cephalopod cognition, rather than whether her family was still intact, a gratitude I do not think I would have felt with the same intensity if I had not spent the previous year understanding exactly how close we had come to a very different outcome. My mother, Eileen, whose stroke had inadvertently started the entire chain of loneliness that led to all of this, found out about what happened considerably later than everyone else, almost a year and a half after the confrontation, and I want to describe that conversation because it closed a loop I had been carrying quietly the whole time. I had never told her the real reason we'd needed her aid that particular Thursday afternoon, and I had spent a year and a half feeling a strange, low-grade guilt about the fact that her own decline, entirely outside her control, had been the specific circumstance that created the loneliness Adrian had exploited, a guilt I had never said out loud to anyone, not even Ray, not even Dr. Nanda Kumar, until I finally said it to my mother herself, sitting beside her bed on an ordinary Sunday visit, the words coming out almost involuntarily, "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I think some part of me has been afraid you'd blame yourself for it, and I don't want you carrying that." My mother, who has lost a good deal of her fine motor control since the stroke but none of her sharpness, listened to the entire story, longer than I expected her attention span to hold these days, and when I finished, she reached over with her weaker hand and gripped my wrist with more strength than I expected and said, "Marcus, listen to me. My stroke did not do this. A criminal, thousands of miles away, running a factory of stolen photographs and stolen affection, did this. You did not do this by driving out here every weekend to help your mother, and Denise did not do this because she's a bad wife. She did this because she is a human being who got lonely during a genuinely hard season and a predator found the gap. If you spend one more day blaming my body for what a criminal did on purpose, I'm going to be considerably more upset about that than I ever was about the money." It was, I think, one of the clearest and most useful things anyone said to me during that entire year and a half, delivered by a woman who had every reason to feel guilty herself and chose instead to hand that guilt back to where it actually belonged. I want to describe our 18th wedding anniversary, which fell just under 2 years after the confrontation, because Denise and I made a deliberate choice about how to mark it that I think says something important about where we'd actually arrived. We did not go anywhere expensive or dramatic, partly because we were still actively rebuilding the retirement savings, and partly because both of us had come to feel over those 2 years a kind of suspicion toward grand gestures, having learned the hard way how convincingly a grand gesture can be built entirely out of lies. Instead, we drove 40 minutes to the same small Methodist church where we'd gotten married 18 years earlier, now with a different, younger pastor neither of us knew, and sat in the back pew on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when the sanctuary was empty and just talked, quietly, for almost 2 hours, about the entire arc of our marriage, the good years before any of this, the 18 months of quiet drift, the 5 months of the scam, the 2 years of rebuilding, laying the whole thing out like a single continuous story rather than a good marriage interrupted by a bad chapter. Because Dr. Nandakumar had helped us understand, somewhere in our second year of sessions, that trying to mentally excise the bad chapter entirely, treating it as a foreign object to be surgically removed from an otherwise clean history, was actually making it harder to heal than simply accepting it as a real, permanent, integrated part of who we both were now, scar tissue rather than an open wound we kept pretending wasn't there. Denise asked me, sitting in that pew, whether I ever thought about Adrian, whatever his actual name was, whoever had actually typed those messages, and I told her honestly, sometimes, mostly with a kind of directionless anger that doesn't have anywhere useful to go, because the actual person, or people, or trafficked victim forced into a compound somewhere, whoever they really were, is not someone I will ever get to confront or understand or even properly hate with any specificity, because they were never a real findable person to begin with, just a name attached to a stolen face attached to a script written by people I will also never meet. I told her I had made a kind of peace with that particular unresolved anger by directing it instead towards something useful, which was why, about 18 months after the confrontation, I had started volunteering one evening a month with a regional financial literacy nonprofit that had added a specific module on romance scam awareness, something Ray had connected me to, giving talks, mostly to groups of older adults and community centres, about exactly the mechanics of what had happened to our own family, without using Denise's name or identifying details unless she'd explicitly agreed to it for that specific audience, which she had more than once when the group felt right to her. I gave one of those talks, actually, about 2 years after the confrontation, at a community centre not far from where my mother lives, to a room of about 40 people, mostly over 60, and I told them the whole shape of the story, the watercolour forum, the container in Lagos, the $14,000 final request, the 11 days I spent quietly moving money before I said a word, and I watched, in that room, several people nodding in the specific way people nod when a story is describing something they have already lived through themselves or watched a friend live through. And afterward, an older man came up to me, maybe 70, and told me, quietly, "My daughter went through almost exactly this 2 years ago. $40,000, and we still don't really talk about it in our family. We just sort of pretend it didn't happen. And hearing you talk about actually working through it together instead of just burying it, that's the first time I've heard anyone describe a way through this that isn't just silence." and I remember driving home that night thinking that whatever else this entire ordeal had cost us, and it had cost us a great deal, some part of it had turned, slowly, into something that occasionally helped someone else standing exactly where we had stood. I think it is important, before I bring this story to where it actually stands today, to go back and be honest about the parts of the recovery that never fully resolved, because I do not want to leave you with the impression that everything eventually tied itself into a neat bow, the way stories sometimes get told once enough time has passed to make the telling comfortable. There are still moments, even now, nearly 3 years out from the confrontation, where something small triggers the whole thing again without warning. A commercial for a cruise line, oddly enough, set us both off badly about a year and a half in, some throwaway shot of a cargo ship in the background of an unrelated advertisement, and Denise had to leave the room, and I sat there for a minute deciding whether to follow her or give her space. And I chose to follow her that time, and found her in our bedroom sitting on the edge of the bed, not crying exactly, just very still, and she said, "I hate that a stupid commercial can still do that." And I told her, I don't think hating it makes it happen less. I think it's just going to keep happening sometimes, and we get to decide how we handle it when it does, and that's really all either of us can control at this point. There is also a harder truth I want to include here, because I promised myself at the start of telling this story that I would not sand down the edges to make it more comfortable. My trust in Denise, even now, is not identical to what it was before this happened. I do not think it ever will be, fully, and I have made a kind of peace with that being true rather than fighting against it as though it represents some failure of forgiveness on my part. What I have instead is a different kind of trust, one built consciously and deliberately over nearly 3 years of watching her make small, consistent, unglamorous choices toward honesty, showing me her phone unprompted, telling me about the wrong number, telling me about writing to the stranger in Nebraska, telling me, unprompted, about a moment 8 months ago when an old colleague from a previous job messaged her out of nowhere, and she felt a flicker of the specific kind of flattered attention that had once been dangerous to her, and instead of sitting with that flicker privately the way she once might have, she told me about it that same evening at dinner in front of the kids even casually, the way you'd mention any small thing that happened during your day, and I understood, watching her do that this was not the same as the trust we had before, blind and unexamined, and it turned out more fragile than either of us knew. This was trust rebuilt with its eyes open, which I have come to believe is actually the sturdier kind, even though it took a catastrophe to teach either of us how to build it that way. I want to tell you about a final conversation Denise and I had, about 2.5 years after the confrontation, because I think it represents the clearest possible summary of where we eventually landed, and because she gave me permission, in the process of deciding to tell this story at all, to include it. We were driving home from a parent-teacher conference for Sophie, who was doing extremely well, incidentally, the specific well-adjusted normalcy of a kid whose home life had stabilized underneath her, even through a period she'd been mostly too young to fully understand, and Denise said, out of nowhere, "Somewhere on the highway I used to think the scariest thing that could happen to our marriage was you finding out. And now I think the scariest thing that could have happened was you never finding out, and me never getting caught, and both of us just quietly drifting further apart for another 5, 10, 15 years, until we were the kind of old married couple who don't actually know each other anymore, but have simply gotten too used to the arrangement to change it." I told her I had thought something similar more than once in the 2.5 years since, and that as strange as it was to say out loud, some very small, very specific part of me was almost grateful that whatever happened all at once and catastrophically enough that we could not possibly ignore it, rather than slowly enough that we might have spent the rest of our lives calling a slow-motion disaster a normal marriage. I do not want anyone listening to this to hear that sentence as an endorsement of what happened, or a suggestion that the scam was somehow a blessing in disguise, because I do not believe that, and Denise does not believe that either, and I want to be extremely clear about that distinction before I close this out. $22,000 of our family's savings is gone, permanently, taken by people who will very likely never face any real consequence for what they did to us, or to the hundreds of other families identified in that same shell account cluster. Our children carry a version of this story now that they did not choose, and will carry in some form for the rest of their lives. Denise carries a specific, permanent scar of having been fooled by a stolen photograph and a script written by strangers. A scar that shows up unexpectedly in cruise ship commercials and probably always will. None of that is a blessing. All of it is a genuine, Permanent loss that I would undo in a heartbeat if undoing it were an option available to either of us. What I'm telling you honestly is that inside a genuine catastrophe, my wife and I found a version of honesty with each other that we had not managed to find in the 18 quiet, drifting months that preceded it, and that finding it that way, through crisis instead of through gentler means, does not make the crisis good, it just makes the outcome, 3 years later, something other than pure loss. I want to go back, before I close, and describe in more careful detail the actual warning signs I've since learned to recognise, because Ray has told me more than once that the single most useful thing I can do with this story is make the specific mechanics of the fraud clear enough that someone listening recognises their own situation before it goes as far as ours did. The first sign, looking back, was the impossibility of a real-time video call, always explained away by unreliable satellite internet from some remote port. A technical excuse that sounds plausible exactly once, and should sound considerably less plausible the fifth or sixth time it gets repeated over 5 months. The second sign was the speed and specificity of emotional escalation. A stranger declaring love, describing a shared future in vivid sensory detail, a porch in Charleston with a specific colour of shutters, within a time frame that would be alarmingly fast for any real relationship, but that felt, to Denise at the time, like simply finding someone unusually compatible unusually quickly. The third sign, the one Ray told me is almost universal across every single case in his 9 years of working these, was the specific pattern of financial requests, always being framed as temporary, always resolved by one final payment that would unlock some larger sum, a container, an inheritance, a business fortune. Always any week now, because a scam that asked for the full amount up front would end the relationship immediately, while a scam that asks for small escalating amounts against the promise of an enormous future payout can be extended, patiently, for months or even years, extracting considerably more total money than a single large ask ever could. I've also learned, since, some of the specific technical and financial precautions Ray recommends to anyone worried they might be in a similar situation, and I want to include them here because I think they matter more than almost anything else in this story if even one person listening recognises their own circumstances in it. Reverse image search any profile photograph, a 5-minute task that would have exposed Adrian Cole's stolen identity in the very first week if either of us had thought to run it. Treat any request for money from someone you have never met in person, regardless of how long you've been talking or how genuine the connection feels, as an immediate serious warning sign, not a reasonable favour between two people who care about each other. And if you are the spouse or family member who discovers a suspicious pattern in a loved one's finances, know that you have the same legal right I exercised, as a joint account holder, to move shared funds into an account solely in your own name, without needing the other person's permission, a right that exists precisely because joint accounts are legally structured around mutual trust. And that right can be the single most important tool available to you if you find yourself standing where I stood that Saturday morning on the phone with Ray, watching a number climb toward a catastrophe you still have a narrow window to prevent. I think about the 11 days between finding that first message and sitting down at the kitchen table with that manila folder more than almost any other stretch of time in my life, because I think they represent the hardest, loneliest, most consequential decision I have ever made without consulting a single person in my daily life except one college friend I hadn't spoken to in years. I do not know, even now, 3 years later, whether every piece of that decision was correct. I know Andrew still believes quietly that I should have confronted her the day I found the message, and some days I wonder whether a faster, angrier reaction might have spared us some of what came after, though I genuinely do not believe it would have, because the money would have been gone regardless of how fast I reacted once I knew, and the 11 days brought us something I do not think a faster confrontation would have, which was the complete picture, the full folder, the entire 5 months laid out clearly enough that Denise and I could actually see the whole shape of what had happened to us instead of arguing our way through a series of partial revelations over successive weeks. I want to be honest that there were nights during those 11 days when the strain of maintaining an ordinary household while holding that knowledge alone nearly broke something in me that had nothing to do with Denise at all. I remember one specific night, about a week in, standing in the shower long after the water had gone cold, having what I can only describe as a silent physical breakdown, not crying exactly, just a kind of full-body shaking. I did not have words for at the time and still struggle to fully describe. Grief and rage and a strange specific loneliness all arriving at once, because I could not tell a single person in my own house what was actually happening, could not tell Tyler why I seemed distracted, could not tell Sophie why I hugged her a little longer than usual at bedtime that week, could not tell Denise the one thing that was consuming every waking thought I had, because telling her too soon risked losing whatever chance we had left to actually save something. I got out of that shower, dried off, and went downstairs and helped Tyler with a science project due the next day, because that is what the 11 days required of me, an entire separate life running underneath the visible one. And I do not think I fully processed how much that specific kind of sustained, solitary vigilance cost me until months later, in one of our counselling sessions, when Dr. Nandakuma asked me directly whether anyone had checked on me during that period, and I realised, answering her, that the honest answer was no, not really, not until Ray, and that I had spent those 11 days holding up an entire household's worth of ordinary function on top of a secret large enough to end our marriage, entirely alone. I want to describe, too, how this experience changed the way I do my actual job, because it is a strange, unexpected thread running through this whole story that I did not anticipate when it started. I manage warehouse operations for a living, and a meaningful part of that job involves training new supervisors on how to spot irregularities before they become disasters, a shipment discrepancy that looks small on Monday and becomes a six-figure inventory loss by Friday if nobody notices the pattern early enough. About a year and a half after the confrontation, I found myself, almost without meaning to, applying the exact same instincts to a completely different situation, when a younger supervisor at my company, a woman named Priscilla Hutchins, mentioned during a casual break room conversation that her mother, recently widowed, had started talking about a new online friend she'd met through a genealogy research forum, an old flame from decades ago who'd supposedly resurfaced after finding her name while researching his own family tree. A story that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up the moment Priscilla described it, because it followed the exact contour of the same script that had nearly destroyed my own family 18 months earlier. I told Priscilla, carefully, not to panic her, but to actually give her something useful. Some of what I'd learned, the reverse image search, the impossibility of video calls, the pattern of small requests escalating toward larger ones justified by an always imminent windfall, and I watched her face change as she recognized in real time elements of what her mother had already described to her over recent weeks. She went home that weekend and did exactly what Ray had once told me to do. Quietly gathered information rather than confronting her mother immediately, and found, within days, an early-stage version of precisely the same operation, a supposed insurance settlement from a car accident overseas that needed a small advance fee to release, a request for $600 that had not yet been paid. Because Priscilla caught it in week 3 instead of month 5, her mother lost $600 instead of $22,000, a difference that still strikes me as almost unbearably poignant every time I think about it. The entire difference between a survivable mistake and a family-altering catastrophe, sometimes coming down to nothing more than whether someone happened to recognize the pattern early enough, which is exactly why Ray had been so insistent, from that very first Saturday phone call, that our case become part of the data other investigators and other families could eventually learn from. Priscilla thanked me formally, in an email I still have saved, though I told her repeatedly she did not need to thank me for something that had cost my own family so much to learn. And I remember thinking, reading that email, that this was perhaps the clearest, most concrete example I had yet encountered of Denise's own instinct, one she'd expressed writing to that stranger in Nebraska, the instinct to take a catastrophe and turn some small piece of it outward into something useful for somebody else standing at the very beginning of the same nightmare. And I told Denise about Priscilla's mother that same evening, and watched her cry quietly at the kitchen table. Not from sadness this time, but from something that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of learning that the worst 5 months of your life had, indirectly, through a chain of coincidences neither of us could have planned, spared someone else's mother from living through her own worst 5 months. I think, if I am honest about what I would say to a version of myself 3 years in the past, sitting at that same kitchen table with an ordinary electric bill and no idea what was coming, and I do not think I would tell him to watch Denise more closely, or to distrust her, because I do not believe distrust would have prevented any of this, and I do not think a marriage built on surveillance instead of presence would have been a marriage worth protecting, even if it had somehow avoided this specific catastrophe. What I would tell him, if I could, is simpler and harder than watch her more closely. I would tell him, Stop disappearing into your mother's decline and calling it strength. Tell your wife, every single week, not just in the hard months, but especially in the hard months, exactly how much her presence is holding you together, because a marriage does not run on the absence of conflict. It runs on the presence of two people who keep choosing actively, deliberately on the tired nights as much as the easy ones, to actually show up for each other. And the moment either person stops showing up, even quietly, even with the best of intentions, even while believing they are protecting the other person from a burden, they have opened a door that someone else, somewhere, is very likely already looking for a way to walk through. I have asked myself many times over these 3 years whether I would make the same choices again: the 11 days of silence, the quiet movement of the money, the manila folder laid out like a supplier audit instead of a conversation, and I keep arriving at the same answer, which is that I would, not because I believe it was the only correct way to handle a catastrophe like this one, but because it was the way that matched who I actually am. Methodical, careful, more comfortable gathering complete information before acting than reacting in the heat of the first discovery. And I have come to believe that the specific way you handle a crisis like this one should match who you actually are as a person, rather than some external standard of how a betrayed spouse is supposed to behave, because performing someone else's version of righteous anger, when it does not match your own actual temperament, tends to produce decisions you do not actually trust yourself to stand behind 3 years later. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my own boss, a man named Harold Pruitt, who has run our regional distribution operation for almost 20 years, and who I had always thought of as a purely business-minded man, someone I would never have imagined confiding in about something this personal. Found out about our situation almost by accident, when I requested an unusual amount of unpaid time off during that 14-day window immediately following the confrontation, time I needed for the initial FBI filing and the first several counselling sessions, and frankly, simply to hold myself together enough to keep functioning at work at all. I told him only the barest outline, a family financial matter, and he surprised me, sitting in his office with the door closed, by saying, "Marcus, I've been at this company 22 years, and in that time I've had 3 different employees come to me with some version of this exact situation. A spouse, a parent, sometimes an adult child drained by one of these online schemes, and every single time the employee tried to handle it completely alone and completely silently, the way I suspect you're trying to handle it right now. Take the time you need. Take more than you think you need. This job will still be here." I do not know why that conversation surprised me as much as it did, except that I think I had absorbed some assumption, without ever examining it, that admitting any of this at work would read as weakness or incompetence, and Harold's plain, unhurried kindness that afternoon did more to make me feel like a person, rather than a walking liability, than almost anything else that happened in those early weeks. I think, too, about the specific role that Denise's job played in her own recovery, because I do not want this story to leave the impression that she spent the following years as a passive figure simply being forgiven, or not forgiven, by the people around her. Denise went back to work at the orthopedic practice 3 days after the confrontation, and I remember asking her, gently, whether she wanted more time, and she told me, "No, Marcus, I need somewhere to go where I am simply Denise the office manager, competent and useful and not currently drowning, at least for 8 hours a day," and I understood exactly what she meant, because I had felt some version of the same relief walking into my own warehouse operations meetings during that same period, the specific mercy of a room where nobody knew what had happened and you got to simply be good at your actual job for a few uninterrupted hours. Her colleagues at the practice, incidentally, never learned any of the details, though I know at least 2 of them. Women she'd worked alongside for years noticed she seemed different for a stretch of months and asked gently if everything was all right at home, and Denise told them only that she and I were working through something difficult, without specifics. A boundary she maintained deliberately, she told me later, because she wanted at least one part of her daily life to remain entirely free of the story, a place where she was simply competent and reliable, rather than a cautionary tale. And I think that boundary, small as it sounds, did more for her actual day-to-day functioning during the hardest months than almost anything else besides the counselling itself. I think, often, about how many different people it actually took to hold our specific family together through the worst of this, because I do not think Denise and I could have done it as just the 2 of us alone in a closed room. The people who held us up during the worst of it were Ray and Carol and my mother and Harold Pruitt and Dr. Nanda Kumar, and eventually, in the strangest and most unexpected turn of the entire story, a scattered handful of strangers on an online support forum and a stranger in Nebraska. Denise had never met and likely never will meet in person, all of them arriving in their own ways, to hold up pieces of a family that very nearly came apart over a stolen photograph and a script written to exploit exactly the kind of quiet, ordinary loneliness that exists, I now understand, in more marriages than anyone driving past them on an ordinary street in Ashford Falls, Pennsylvania would ever guess. I want to close this part of the story by telling you plainly what our life actually looks like now, 3 years out, because I think the ordinary, unglamorous shape of it matters more than any dramatic final scene could. We still live in the same house. Tyler is 17 now, applying to colleges, still talkative in the specific expanded way he became again after that 15th birthday conversation in the kitchen. Sophie is 12, has moved on from octopuses to a fairly serious interest in astronomy, and still, on the nights I get home late, comes to find me before she goes to sleep to tell me one specific fact she learned that day, a habit I hope she never entirely outgrows. Denise and I still go to counselling, though only once a month now instead of weekly, a wind-down doctor. Nandakumar suggested about 2 years in, once she felt the foundational work was solid enough to sustain itself with less frequent maintenance. We're still rebuilding the retirement account, about 60% of the way back to where the projections say we would have been without the loss, a number Beatrice Alsop reviews with us twice a year, with the same brisk, unsentimental clarity she's brought to every conversation since the beginning. I still drive that same Honda Odyssey, now past 230,000 miles, a fact that has become something of a family joke, Sophie recently suggesting we give it a proper burial when it finally does die, instead of simply towing it to a junkyard like an ordinary car. Denise still paints, incidentally, still posts occasionally to that same watercolour forum where all of this began, a fact that surprised me when she first mentioned returning to it about a year after the confrontation, and I asked her, honestly, doesn't that feel strange, going back to the exact place this started? And she told me something that I think demonstrates better than almost anything else how far she had actually come in her own understanding of what happened to her. She said, Marcus, for a long time I thought the forum itself was somehow contaminated, like the place where it happened was to blame the way you might blame a room where something terrible occurred. But the forum didn't do anything to me. A predator did something to me, using the forum as a hunting ground, the same way a mugger uses a dark parking lot without the parking lot itself being guilty of anything. I like painting. I like the community of people who talk about brushwork and colour mixing and nothing else. I'm not going to let a criminal take that away from me too, on top of everything else he already took. She paints landscapes now mostly, and a few months ago she painted the harbour scene again, the one that started this whole story with an unsolicited compliment from a stranger, and this time she posted it, with a caption that made me laugh out loud when she showed me something like, repainting this one on my own terms, no commentary needed, and dozens of genuine ordinary strangers left kind, unremarkable comments about the brushwork, and none of it, this time, cost her a single dollar. I think about the word forgiveness a great deal still, because it's the word everyone eventually asks me about when they hear this story. Have you forgiven her? And I have come to distrust the word somewhat, because I think it implies a single completed action, a door that either opens all the way or stays shut, when what actually happened between Denise and me was something slower and more granular than that. 1,000 small decisions across 3 years, to stay in the room during a hard conversation instead of walking out permanently, to reach for her hand during a bad night instead of turning away, to believe her account of a wrong number instead of interrogating it, to choose again and again, on ordinary unremarkable Tuesdays with no drama attached to them at all, to keep building something together instead of walking away from the wreckage of what a stranger's script had done to us. If that accumulation of small daily choices is what forgiveness actually means, then yes, I have forgiven her, more completely than I would have believed possible sitting in my car in that office parking lot 3 years ago, watching a number climb past $22,000. If forgiveness means the debt is erased and the ledger reads 0 as though none of it ever happened, then no, I have not forgiven her, and I do not think I ever fully will, because some things simply become part of the permanent architecture of a marriage rather than passing through it and leaving no trace. I want to end this story where I think it actually belongs, ending, not at the kitchen table with the manila folder, and not even on that back porch on our 17th anniversary, but on an ordinary Thursday evening about 3 months ago, because I think it captures, better than any single dramatic scene could, the actual texture of what we rebuilt. Denise was at the kitchen table with her watercolours spread out, working on a commission a friend of Carol's had asked her to do, a painting of a lake house for a retirement gift. Tyler was upstairs on a video call with a friend, laughing at something I couldn't hear, the specific, unguarded laugh of a kid who feels safe in his own house. Sophie was on the living room floor with a library book about the rings of Saturn, narrating facts to nobody in particular the way she has done about every subject she's ever loved since she was old enough to talk. And I was standing in the kitchen doorway for just a moment, not doing anything in particular, just looking at all of it, the paint water going slightly grey in its jar, the sound of my son's laugh through the ceiling, my daughter's voice explaining planetary rings to an audience of stuffed animals who had, apparently, inherited the role Sophie's octopuses once held, and I thought, this is the thing I nearly lost. Not the money, though the money mattered, and not even entirely the marriage in the abstract, but this specifically, the actual physical fact of this house, holding these 4 particular people on an ordinary Thursday evening with nothing dramatic happening at all. And I understood, standing in that doorway, that I would make every single one of the same choices again. The 11 days of silence, the quiet transfer of every dollar we had left, the manila folder laid out like an audit, if it meant arriving back at this exact, unremarkable, ordinary, precious evening, instead of whatever version of our lives existed on the other side of a choice to react faster, louder, and with less care about what we actually still had left to save. Denise looked up from her painting at some point and caught me standing there, and she didn't ask what I was thinking, she just smiled. The specific, tired, warm smile of a woman who's done a great deal of hard work to be able to smile like that again without it costing her anything false, and I smiled back and went and sat down across from her at the table and asked her about the lake house she was painting, and she told me at some length about the specific challenge of getting the reflection of the dock right in the water, and we sat there for the better part of an hour, talking about nothing important at all, which is, I have come to understand, the entire point of everything we fought for over these 3 years. Not a dramatic reconciliation, not a single perfect moment of absolution, just an ordinary Thursday at an ordinary kitchen table with 2 people who chose one more time in an unremarkable way that would mean nothing to anyone watching from outside to actually be there with each other. If you have listened to this whole story, I want to leave you with the same thing Ray left me with on that very first Saturday morning phone call, because I think it matters more than anything else I could say. If you notice a pattern in a loved one's finances that does not add up, do not wait for certainty before you start protecting what you can still protect. Gather the facts quietly and completely before you confront anyone, because a confrontation made too early on partial information often does more damage than the extra week or 2 it takes to actually understand the whole picture. And if you are the one who has fallen into a relationship with someone you have never met in person, someone who always has a reason a video call is impossible, someone whose crisis always resolves with one more payment, please, for your own sake, run a reverse image search on their photographs tonight, before the compliment about your painting turns into a container stuck in a port you have never heard of. Some stories end in $22,000 and a marriage nearly lost. Ours ended, eventually, in an ordinary Thursday evening at a kitchen table, and I would not wish the 3 years between those 2 points on anyone, but I am deeply, permanently grateful for exactly where they led us. Thank you for listening to our story. If it moved you, if it reminded you to check in on someone you love, or to look a little more carefully at your own family's finances, or simply to arrive, fully, in your own house tonight instead of quietly disappearing into the next task on your list, please consider subscribing to this channel where we share one true story like this every single day. Real accounts of the moments that test a marriage and the choices that either break it or rebuild it into something stronger than it was before. Leave a comment and tell us honestly what you would have done in my place, whether you would have confronted her the same night, or whether, like me, you would have taken the 11 days to gather the whole truth first. Share this with anyone in your life who might need to hear it, because the next person who recognizes a warning sign in time because of a story like this one might be someone you love. Thank you for being here, and we will see you in the next story.